everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk today about some work we've been doing over the last couple of years and share these resources with you. So the speakers today are myself, Lydia Olander, who directs the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke and leads the National Ecosystem Services Partnership. And two of the policy associates who work with my program, Katie Warnell and Sarah Mason. And I'll note that Sarah Mason helps me keep the partnership running. So she's also part of the National Ecosystem Services Partnership team. All right, so before I dive into the details, I just want to note, please feel free to put questions or issues into the chat box. Sarah will be watching that and we'll jump in if needed. And we're keeping your lines muted, so that's the best way to contact us during the presentation. Sarah, if there's anything else we need to share up front, I think the only other thing may be that we're recording the presentation because we always share these afterwards. Great.
Yep, I think that covers it.
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to talk about a kind of ecosystem services toolkit that we've been building over the last few years, and we'll share some examples as well. So just to give a little background to anyone who's new to the partnership, the National Ecosystem Services Partnership has been around since around 2009. We have a community of practice, email list, webinars, and quarterly newsletter that we've been running. And since around 2012, we've been working a lot with federal agencies to help put the concept of ecosystem services into practice, figuring out how to move it into daily management and policy decisions. And this started with the development of an online guidebook that's still available. And that collected and shared a suite of kind of methods and developed case studies from agencies, looked at some kind of federal authorities and how ecosystem services fit in. And to that, we've continued to add, we have a page for resources where we continue to add new tools and resources that are available from the broader ecosystem services community that might be of use to people. Our recent work over the last couple of years has really worked on developing some tools and resources for natural resource managers that will help them more easily and effectively incorporate ecosystem services into their day-to-day work. And we'll be talking about that today. So we're going to talk about why this toolkit was created, why the things we put together are in it. And two of the main reasons that I'm going to just walk through at the beginning here are we wanted to get all the way to what matters to people. So we wanted to get to the ecosystem services outcomes, the social and economic benefits that people receive from nature. And then second, we wanted to see if there was a way to do this in a consistent manner. We know that ecosystem services tend to have a lot of context and site specificity. So how do we do this in a way that's consistent and credible over time so it can be used kind of at a larger scale for decision makers? And then we're going to go through some example applications, and then we'll show you the website where all these materials can be found. So I'm going to start by just giving a little history and context. Kind of around 2015, that time period, there was a lot of discussion about the authorities that federal agencies had to incorporate ecosystem services, and kind of growing understanding that there was sufficient authority within pretty much all of the agencies to move forward in incorporating ecosystem services into how they made decisions. And in 2016, there was a lot of momentum on ecosystem services underway. A lot of different things had taken place. In 2012, the Forest Service had a forest planning rule with ecosystem services incorporated. In 2013, the principles, rules, and guidance for water resource management came along. And just a side note, the Corps of Engineers was not allowed to incorporate that until very recently, when the Congress changed its mind and is now asking the Corps to update its use of these the principles, rules, and guidance. And then in 2015, the Executive Offices for the President put out a memo asking agencies to kind of fully consider ecosystem services and started the process of an implementation guidance. And while that never got out the door before that administration left, as far as I know, it's still sitting somewhere in the executive offices. And I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the conversations that were happening at that time, which influenced this work. So the first is the Council for Environmental Quality in the White House offices. We're really interested in ecosystem services as something that could be incorporated into the National Environmental Policy Act and the environmental impact statements. Their sense was that this would be a good way to make sure that we're not just thinking about the ecological outcomes, but also how those influence and affect human well-being. And the Office of Management and Budget was thinking that ecosystem services could help them better account for environmental benefits to kind of understand the broader implications for people. And to do that, they needed consistency in how those were accounted for across projects and programs. At this time, I feel like the agencies were still struggling with how to do this, how to put this on the ground. It's that data and methods were complicated. How did they kind of scale up something like this? And then in 2016, with the election, things slowed down. There wasn't as much momentum from the top. There was a lot of time within the agencies to start to dig in and try to figure these things out. And so that's what we've been doing in partnership with a number of federal agencies over the last few years. And this work came out of that. And so I'll just kind of note that at the top of the page there's a note about kind of what we were working on. And so I think have been focused on, we had done some work on kind of common ground on methods and authorities. We'd already done some work on kind of the methods gap, quantification, monetization, and data issues. And more recently, we were trying to get at user-friendly, transparent methods that take us all the way to what matters to people and that provide consistency and reliability. So these tools are trying to help with that piece of the puzzle. Okay. So what I mean by going to all the way to what matters to people is, here's an example. This is from the Gulf Restore Council, and these are their the goals for their program. And so you can see that there are 3 of these goals that are pretty traditional for somebody thinking about restoration and habitats. We have habitat restoration metrics, water quality improvement goals, marine resource protection goals, but then we have 2 that are a little different. We have community resilience and economic revitalization. And those are a little different. Those are somehow going to be connected to natural resource management and coastal restoration, but it's not something we often think about. So how do we connect these natural resource changes to these kinds of outcomes? So these are going all the way to what kind of manages for social and economic outcomes and human well-being. So what we did is we tried to make sure we understood how different interventions, natural resource interventions like habitat restoration, can affect human well-being. And so we've built these, what we call conceptual models or logic models that connect interventions like oyster reef restoration all the way through to the social and economic changes. And ecosystem services are that linkage between the ecological change and the socioeconomic change. And I just want you to kind of understand this kind of model design because we use it repeatedly in the work that we've done. So we have an intervention in the dark blue on the left. This could be a natural resource management activity, or it could be an external stressor. It causes changes in the biophysical and ecological system. It can also have direct changes on the socioeconomic outcomes. So there could be a direct effect on jobs as well. I don't have an arrow for that in here, but that's also included. So it goes through these biophysical and ecological changes, and then it has an effect on how humans interact with nature. So human activity changes, like changes in recreational activity or education, or commercial fishing, for example. And then those have an effect on social and economic outcomes that matter to people, whether they're economic impact measures or health impacts or effects on property protection. So those are socioeconomic changes. And then we can potentially measure those socioeconomic changes with metrics. So the toolkit contains these 2 things. It contains models that link an intervention to these socioeconomic changes, and then it includes a set of metrics for tracking these socioeconomic changes that are tied to these natural resource management interventions. So this is what one of the models looks like in a bit more detail. This is a living shoreline example. And you can see it kind of moves through the same color coding, where we've got the gray and the green showing the kind of intermediates, biophysical and ecological changes. And in this case, we used green to indicate ecological components that are commonly measured or are targets for natural resource management. But that's kind of just to kind of note that. And then we focus on the blue and the yellow. So the human activity changes, and then how all of these interact to produce the socioeconomic outcomes on the right-hand side in yellow. And so we have things related to shoreline and property protection, a number of different kinds of human health outcomes. We have different kinds of economic activity measures related to jobs or labor income. And these can be from commercial and industrial outcomes, from recreation, or from restoration itself. There can be climate change related outcomes. And then there's a bunch of things that could fall under cultural values. Education is one, but there's a whole bunch of other kinds of things like livelihood options, traditional values, existence value, et cetera. And those will vary by the circumstance. And so not a lot of detail on some of those here. But this is what these models look like. Next slide, please. So how do these ecosystem services conceptual models support management? We see these models as kind of the foundation for everything we're doing in these toolkits and for all of the different projects that we're doing. And we find them very useful in interacting with the resource agencies and stakeholders that we engage. So first, it takes us all the way to what matters to people. We end up getting beyond the ecological and biophysical and make very transparent what those outcomes, social and economic outcomes, look like. They're relatively easy to access. They sometimes look relatively complicated, but when you look at them, they're very logical flow, and there's really no expertise needed to understand what they mean or to understand what ecosystem services are in this context. And once they're already created, there's minimal time commitment to have that conversation based around these models. They're adaptable to your context. So you can take a general model like the one I just showed on living shorelines and adapt it based on the project that you're working on, the geography that you're working in, the scale of the project. And all of the models that we've provided, there's editable versions where you can download them and edit them. These models are really useful for facilitating dialogue and developing a shared understanding among stakeholders and experts. We've done a lot of that in the workshops that we'll talk about later. They also can help ensure that there's no critical ecosystem services impacts, benefits, or trade-offs that are missing from consideration. So basically just enhances transparency so everybody can see what outcomes are being considered and can kind of flag things that might be missing and make sure that those are clearly considered in a process. They also are helpful to identifying what communities are affected. So this can be useful for highlighting cultural services, for getting at equity issues. So when we understand what the outcomes are, we can think about each of the outcomes and which communities might be impacted by those outcomes, positively or negatively. They also can provide a framework for thinking about best available science. We'll show a little later how we've used these to do literature reviews based on these model frameworks to understand where our gaps in understanding are of the connections between an intervention and these outcomes, which can help identify kind of key research and monitoring needs for programs. And then we've used these models as the basis for developing a set of socioeconomic metrics that best capture the outcomes that are identified in the models. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And they've also been used as a foundation for quantification so that you can develop kind of predictive scenario modeling tools that kind of are built on these model frameworks. So now moving on to metrics. So a lot of times we think about the biophysical metrics, and these don't get us all the way to what we're talking about in terms of social and economic outcomes. These are biodiversity metrics, oyster biomass metrics, and these are all from Half Moon Reef by the Nature Conservancy. So, and just show you kind of this is the biophysical side of things, but then the Half Moon Reef folks also did the social and economic side of things. So these are the kinds of metrics we're thinking about when we talk about social and economic metrics for our models. So this is things like familiarity and knowledge about half moon restoration and its impacts, number of anglers that have a more satisfying experience, increased recreational fishing revenues and economic impact of that recreational fishing, the change in jobs and annual labor income from the restoration project. So these are the kinds of measures and metrics we're trying to integrate into this process. And I also want to mention consistency briefly. So this was another, as I mentioned, key kind of objective after our conversations with the Office of Management and Budget, and also talking to other agencies about kind of rolling up results from multiple projects and programs. Like, how do they do that? They need some consistency on how ecosystem services are measured. So we think that consistency can help with comparing alternative actions, plans, or programs. It can be used for tracking progress over time, for coordinating with partners if you're using common models and metrics, for streamlining applications, so you're not reinventing the wheel every time, you're using the same kind of model and metrics to inform your process. And then for scaling up, so you can look across multiple projects and select the same metrics to kind of look at a broader scale and look at how multiple projects are having an impact. And all of this consistency kind of discussion came from a proposal that we wrote in 2016 for the Office of Management and Budget about how we thought you could integrate consistency and how ecosystem services were measured by agencies. So we think for moving towards consistency, you can work across decision contexts, whether this is geography, scale, project type, by looking at common elements and outcomes in these conceptual models. So they can have common elements, and then they can be adapted to specific contexts. So the models have both. They have, commonalities across different kinds of geography, scales, and project types, as well as things that are specific to their projects and their contexts. And so it hopefully will provide both the opportunity for consistency as well as meet the needs for specific context for projects. And then on the metric side, we wanted a common set of metrics that could be used consistently for a program or across a region that would be used in partnership with a broader set of optional metrics. And so that's what we've been moving forward to develop. So overall, this is how we see this. We see that you have a common set of ecosystem services conceptual models and a common set of metrics that are used system-wide, whatever that system might be. And then you can adapt them to local contexts and habitats for various management needs, whether that's comparing alternatives or prioritizing investments or monitoring and reporting. So we see that these models and metrics could be useful for lots of different things: planning, alternatives comparison, identifying stakeholders, engaging stakeholders, monitoring and reporting, program assessment, different educational outreach. And we'll talk through a number of these different examples in just a moment. So far we have found this could be useful for natural resource managers in various different contexts, and as well as for those that are funding and managing programs. And also for outreach and education coordinators who find this as a kind of useful way to identify communities to engage with and to better communicate the broader benefits of projects. So we're going to jump into some examples now, and then we'll walk you through the online toolkit. So the examples we're going to talk about vary a fair amount, and so we have some things we've done across all of them. They all have conceptual models that have been used in different ways, but we're going to dive in and talk about specific applications just to show a variety. So for the Forest Service, we're going to talk about how a project model was adapted to a planning context for a specific forest, and talk about a predictive model library we've developed. For agricultural nutrient management, we're going to talk about an evidence library we created. And for work we've done with NOAA and the NERS, the Natural Estuarine Reserves Research System, we are going to talk about a facilitation guide we created, as well as how we specified some of these models to specific projects using the facilitation methods, and some education and materials. And then for the Gulf of Mexico, we'll talk about a framework that's been developed for kind of matching projects to outcomes and developing a common set of metrics for monitoring and reporting across the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Katie if she's still available and online.
Yep.
Are you there, Katie?
Yes.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll kick off the first example, which is how we've used some forest planning models and developed metrics in collaboration with the Forest Service and a particular national forest. So over the past year, we've been working with several different offices within the Forest Service to develop a few general conceptual models, which are the ones listed on the right side of this slide. So they were looking at a variety of different management actions that are commonly used on Forest Service lands. That includes timber management, recreational management, and then a few models related to how they manage fires. As part of that initial project, we also created a predictive model library for one of the models, which was the combined timber and fire management model. And I'll show you more what that looks like in a minute. Basically, we were trying to assess what predictive models are available to quantify the relationships that are shown in that model. And then more recently, and this project is ongoing, we're working with the Ashley National Forest, which is a forest that's currently updating their forest plan. And we've been exploring with them how conceptual models can be used in that planning process. So that's included developing a new version of starting with our recreational management model that's more geared toward their recreation planning context. And then also developing some socioeconomic metrics building from that model for use in their environmental impact statement that's part of that planning process. Next slide. So this is the fire and timber harvest conceptual model, and don't worry that you can't read it. The point here is that the arrows that you see in the model are color-coded, and then some of them are dashed. And so this version of the model is reflecting the results of our analysis of the predictive models that are available for use related to these relationships. So the arrows that are colored in, that indicates that there is a predictive model, usually more than one, available to quantify that relationship. And we grouped those predictive models into the different categories shown on the left. Where there are dashed arrows, that means that there's no predictive model that's available, but there's a fair amount of information in the literature about that particular relationship, which could be used to come up with a rough quantitative estimate. And where there are dotted arrows, that means that there is no predictive model and there's limited information in the literature. So it would be hard to even come up with a rough quantitative estimate for that relationship. So this version of the model helps us to see, what we are able to predict using currently available models and where there are gaps in either predictive model development or in our knowledge. And then the larger predictive model library document, the cover page is shown on this slide, has additional information about each of those predictive models that we assess. And it includes information like the data that's required to run the models, the amount of time and expertise and computing power that you need, and also how the model has been validated so that you can get a better sense for how accurate it is and how well it will translate to the Forest Service context. Next slide. And then this is related to the ongoing work we have with the Ashley National Forest. So this is an updated version of our kind of general recreation conceptual model. We've had a few virtual workshops with their planning team. And so we were able to update the model, in particular the interventions. So those blue boxes on the far left that are kind of the changes that they're thinking of making. And then this model shows how those changes will influence the rest of the system. A lot of what we've been understanding from our workshops with them are about what what decisions they're thinking about and how their forest plan might reflect different alternatives for land management within the forest, and how different areas of the forest will be used, especially in terms of what recreational activities are available. And so the next step that we're currently working on with them is understanding which of the socioeconomic outcomes, the yellow boxes on the right, are most important in their context, and then putting together a list of metrics to help us actually measure those outcomes. And the ultimate idea is that those metrics will be used in their forest plan EAS to capture the expected impacts of the plan alternatives. All right, next slide. So switching to our second example, this one's focused on nutrient management on agricultural land. We did this in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, and this project was funded by Fertilizer Canada. That organization was interested in getting more information about what we know and what we don't know about how improved fertilizer management and kind of large-scale agriculture will influence not just the kind of water quality issues that are normally talked about, but a whole range of different environmental and socioeconomic changes that they could cause in the system. So we developed two models as part of this project. One is for improved management of nitrogen fertilizer, and the second is for phosphorus fertilizer. And we also did a literature review to understand the evidence that's available for each of the relationships shown in the models. And the results of that literature review are summarized in an evidence library. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the nitrogen management model, and this is a particular version of it that shows the results of that literature review. So in this model, each of the arrows is color-coded, this time to show how strong the evidence was that we found for that relationship in the literature. So the dark green and light green arrows have better evidence behind them than the purple arrows, and in a few cases, there was no evidence at all that we found. Those are the gray arrows. So a version of the model like this is really helpful for identifying gaps in our knowledge and potentially helping to kind of shape what areas might be kind of fertile for future research to help fill in these gaps. And I guess, again, in the evidence library itself, which is a much longer document, there's a version of this for the phosphorus management model as well. And then there's also a summary of the evidence for every one of these arrows. So it includes more of a description about the evidence that we found in the literature and also the reasons for the strength of evidence rating for each of those relationships. Next slide.
All right, so moving on to the coast, this is Sarah Mason talking now, and I'll just take a minute to describe how we used our toolkit resources for a project in collaboration with NOAA and the NERS. So NOAA, as most of you are probably aware, is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the NERS is the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, which is a network of 29 coastal reserves all across the U.S. And they represent a partnership between NOAA and the coastal states. So our idea was that if we developed a set of general ecosystem service conceptual models for common coastal habitats, which you can see listed here on the right, and include models for things like mangroves, oyster reefs, seagrass, salt marsh, beaches and dunes, living shorelines, and barrier islands. Those general habitat models could then be used as a resource for consistency in ecosystem services considerations as they get adapted to specific sites around the country. So we tested this idea with two different research reserve sites, one in North Carolina and one in Florida, to bring stakeholders together in workshop settings to really test out these models, to adapt them, to use them as a basis for selecting socioeconomic metrics, and also to develop education and outreach materials. So through our cooperation with these research reserve sites, we developed a workshop process and wrote a guide that shares our approach for using ecosystem services conceptual models as a facilitation tool. So if you go to the next slide. The guide is really meant for coastal resource managers and outreach professionals who aim to bring ecosystem services deliberately into decision-making and engagement processes related to the coast. And you can see the cover of the guide here, and it's available on our website, but it's really structured to describe the approach for leading various types of workshop sessions, each with a specific goal and output. So the guide walks you through how to make a conceptual model from scratch in a workshop setting, or how to adapt an existing general model to your specific site, also using a stakeholder group. It also talks about how to then use these models to brainstorm and select socioeconomic metrics that can track outcomes of interest for coastal management projects. And then it discusses how to use a conceptual model to assess specific winners and losers of coastal management projects to really understand who beneficiaries of each type of ecosystem service are in your specific case. So we used these facilitation techniques in our work with Rookery Bay Research Reserve in Florida. And we worked with them to think about how to incorporate ecosystem services considerations into a particular mangrove restoration site, which you can see here. So this is an area of mangroves that died off due to reduced connection to tidal flows, among other stressors. And they've recently received funding to restore this area. Next slide. So in our workshop at Rookery Bay, what we did was focus on developing not only a general mangrove model for mangrove restoration in Florida as a whole, but then we worked on adapting it to the specifics of that restoration site in question. So here you can see the structure of the general mangrove model with all of the elements of the model that are not relevant to this particular restoration site grayed out. So we were then left with a model that illustrates the flow of ecological, social, and economic changes that will likely result from this particular restoration project. We then worked to develop metrics that could be used to track progress of these relevant outcomes at that site, and later developed some education and outreach materials that can help share these findings with both students and the community. So to continue on with another coastal project, I'll pass it back to Lydia to talk about our work in the Gulf of Mexico.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Katie. So one other thing about this project that Sarah didn't yet mention is that we're planning to work with NOAA to integrate these models and the tools that we developed into a training program that they are building on ecosystem services. So hopefully there'll be opportunities to learn more about this through NOAA in the near future. Okay, so our next example is from the Gulf of Mexico. We have a project there on ecosystem service logic models and socioeconomic metrics. This project is in partnership with the Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M University and the Nature Conservancy, as well as the Bridge Collaborative. It's funded by the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. And we're partnered with a number of different programs that are working in the Gulf, the Restore Council, National Fish and Wildlife Federation, representatives from each of the states, as well as other organizations that are significantly involved in giving out restoration money and managing restoration projects that have resulted from the Gulf oil spill. And as I mentioned here before, we're looking at all the various goals that these programs have and trying to help them fill in gaps they have in how do they understand the social and economic outcomes that restoration projects can have so that they can target their funding to the ones they're aiming for. And also so they can track them, develop metrics to track and report on outcomes like community resilience and economic revitalization. So we looked at all of the various different kinds of projects that are being funded by these programs across the Gulf, and it's a very wide variety. So it's everything from typical habitat restoration, similar to the models that Sarah just talked about. And so these have been developed particularly for the Gulf of Mexico, as well as models related to habitat connectivity, so reconnection projects, recreation enhancement projects like boat ramps, fishing piers and trails and boardwalks, and then water quality enhancement projects. So these are stormwater and wastewater projects, both green and gray infrastructure type projects. And so we're looking at a very wide range of different kinds of projects that all can have beneficial impacts for coastal ecosystems. And we've developed a suite of products, and this is an ongoing project, so some of it is still incomplete. But we have a set of logic models for all of these different project types and have identified where there are common outcomes across them. We are in the process of developing social economic metrics and measurement protocols. Some of that is done and some of that is underway. We have evidence libraries for salt marsh and oyster reef for the Gulf systems. And we're in the process of developing some guides for practitioners and funders that could help them think about how to use these models and metrics in their work. So for practitioners, this could potentially be for proposals for new projects or for planning, to help them think about the various social and economic benefits their projects might have and communicate those to funders, as well as to identify metrics that they might want to track. And for funders, they could use this to help understand what kinds of outcomes they'll get from different funding opportunities. So if what kinds of projects they fund will give them which kinds of outcomes, but also what kind of metrics they want their projects to track. But also thinking about metrics at the program scale. So trying to understand, are there things that they could track at a more regional level to understand how well their various restoration projects are contributing to the social and economic outcomes of interest. And then we're also building a website database that will go along with all these resources to make these accessible and easy to use. And that's in progress. So just to kind of give a sense of the comparison across these types of projects. So we have here, we're looking at the outcomes from 3 very different types of projects. We have a habitat restoration project, and then we have a habitat restoration project first, and then the center project is a recreational project, and the last one is a stormwater project. And so for these very different types of projects, we do have a range of different kinds of outcomes, but we did find that there are some commonalities across them. And as a result, there are some common metrics that we can use across these projects. So in particular, for example, look at the green color here. Those are metrics related to economic activity. And a number of those are common across these 3 different types of projects. So it could potentially be measured across these different kinds of projects across the Gulf states to do some kind of broader understanding of what's happening. Similarly, we have shoreline protection relating to effect on properties, and the purple, and then and that's coming out of both a habitat project, and then there's also a recreation project that has a similar outcome. So you can see these commonalities that lead to some common metrics that could potentially be used broadly across project types, as well as across regions across the Gulf. And then the last thing we're working on now is how do we get from kind of a list of metrics to actually measuring them. So we're in the process of developing a set of measurement protocols that would go along with these metrics. We're summarizing how we think these would be measured and pointing to examples of where they've been measured in other places, what methods were used. So we have a bunch of metrics that are at the project scale. So things that a project could do. And so these come from existing project data, like number of restoration jobs on a project, from existing data sets. So like there could be number of businesses closed from a disruption from construction or from a flooding impact. For spatial analysis, so shoreline erosion can be estimated using existing spatial data. Or some social surveys that are potentially already being run by projects and programs around educational outreach and knowledge gained. And then at the program scale, we're doing things a little differently. We're thinking about how you could use kind of regional scale economic analysis. So using existing data and do an economic impact analysis to understand the economic implications of restoration broadly by correlating the economic analysis with restoration projects spatially. And similarly, trying to do something with social surveys more broadly that would get us information on knowledge and health impacts, as well as equity, which I'll talk about in just a moment, that again could be correlated with restoration and give us more information about those kinds of outcomes. We've done a lot of thinking about how do you incorporate equity into these different measures and metrics, these outcome measures, and think that there are 2 primary pathways for doing that. So kind of looking at equitable access might be more of a spatial analysis, distance from communities of concern, and kind of whether they're in the supply shed of a service or not. And then equitable distribution is another one. So are these different communities represented in the employment numbers that we're looking at, things like that. And so we're, again, surveys and spatial analysis may be the two tools to use that, to do that. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I feel like you have a sense of the different kinds of projects and applications that we've done. And I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, who's going to just walk you really quickly through the website, and then we'll open it up for questions.
All right, so let me just take over the screen share for a second. All right, so you should be able to see the website now on the screen. And I'll just really quickly give a tour of our online toolkit to give you a sense of how it's structured and what it contains and how it relates to the examples that we just showed. So here's the home page. It gives a little bit of the background that we described at the beginning of the webinar and lets you then jump into the ecosystem services domain that you're particularly interested in. We thought that this was a good way to kind of act as an entry point to get to those resources most applicable to you. So for agricultural services, we have a few example models related to the work on nutrient management that Katie shared earlier. For the forest services, we're continuing to build out our resources, but we have models related to all the work with the Forest Service that we described, and we'll likely have metrics coming soon. And then the Coastal Services portal is the one that's really most fully developed, and that's where I'll dig in now on our tour. But just as a note, this is a continually developing resource, and so we're going to keep adding to it as we learn more, do more projects, and gather more examples. So this is the Coastal Services homepage, and it's divided up into various different sections related to different types of resources that we have available. But I'm going to start today with a tour of the conceptual models collection, since that's really the cornerstone of many of our resources. So you'll see, if it will load, on our conceptual models collection page that we give a little bit of intro and background to what conceptual models are. We actually have an instructional video for how you can use some of our editable models. And then we have all of our models separated into different relevant habitat types. So you can click on the habitat type that's of particular interest to you. So let's dive into the Mangrove model page. And it'll bring up a whole different list of model versions that are relevant for different geographic contexts. So we can look here at the one relevant to the Gulf of Mexico. And for each individual conceptual model, so each row represents a different model, you're going to have a model context document, which is just an overview document that gives you information on how the model was built, details on what it includes, and notes on why the model includes or excludes certain chains or outcomes. So it just gives you a little bit more background on where the model came from. And then once you're actually trying to take a look at the models, you can take a look at the static version of the model. So that's just going to bring up the box and arrow diagram that we've developed that you can print out, use as reference, share with others. But then we also have an editable version of all of our models available. And so that actually lets you bring up this online flowchart software, and you can click on this button down here, which there's, again, that instructional video for how to do this on the website. But it actually brings up a version of the model that you can kind of explore. You can move things around, you can adapt it, you can edit it, you can make it specific to your own personal context. So we want to make those models as applicable to you as possible. So we let you play around with the models that we've already developed. You'll see that some of the models have additional materials associated with them. If we've written up a case study report or developed an evidence library or something like that, some of them will have additional materials that you can click on and learn more about how they were built or how they were used. All right. taking us back to the home page, you'll see that we have a background section over here. If you click on that, it just gives you some more information on how to build ecosystem services conceptual models, and that's also where that facilitation guide is housed. And so that's the guide that lets you know how to use ecosystem service conceptual models as a facilitation tool. Down here, if you click on the metrics resources, there's a short description of all the different types of ecosystem services metrics that you can use to monitor different types of outcomes of environmental management projects or restoration projects. And then we have just a bunch of different metrics resources. So we have things like metric criteria that we've used in the past for how you can actually select socioeconomic metrics. We have an example metrics database that contains metrics that we've used to consider for measuring ecosystem services outcomes. And then coming soon will be links to all of our metrics and metrics protocols generated for the Gulf of Mexico project that Lydia just described. So those should be up and finished by the end of the year. We should have that all available on our website. We'll have an initial version soon and then the full version by the end of the year. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail on everything that's contained in the website. I'll just point out really quickly and then I'll let you explore on your own if you're interested. But you'll see we also have links from, this is again the Coastal Ecosystem Services portal homepage. We have links to example evidence libraries. So those are the documents that Katie described, which provide evidence and detail on each and every arrow in one of our models. So we have one of those for an oyster model and for a salt marsh model. We also have a link down here on the bottom right that leads you to example education and outreach resources that have been developed using our models as a jumping off point. And these materials include things like fact sheets, games and activities for K-12 students, and infographics. And then finally, I'll just take us to our use cases page. So these are short write-ups that describe how our models have been used for different purposes and in different contexts that we hope can give inspiration to others on how they could use them too. So these cases just go through how models were used to achieve different types of coastal management or outreach goals. All right, so I will stop there. Lydia, maybe you could bring up the final slide again so that people have the URL to get to the website if they're interested in exploring. But we do have some time for questions. So if anybody wants to type a question into the chat box, we should be able to do a little bit of a Q&A.
Thanks, Sarah. I also just wanted to note that the development of each of these models and all of the metrics have involved a lot of different experts who have contributed their time, as well as a number of practitioners on the ground. So they involve a lot of phone calls or workshops and other efforts to kind of make sure we've incorporated the wide variety of expertise that are needed to kind of inform models that cover all the ground that these cover, from health experts to economic experts, et cetera. So I just wanted to, we haven't really given credit to all the different people that have helped us do this. So I can't see the chat, Sarah, so I'm going to let you be in charge.
I can mediate. So we do have one question that asks about values are based on human preferences, which are context dependent and vary over time, space, and geography. How does or do the models account for this? Right.
So I think one of the key things is that the kind of the values the metrics we're incorporating are things like are there jobs and economic impact and direct health impacts, looking at existing cases of certain like mosquito-borne diseases, things like that. We are not taking it to the point where we're looking at social welfare values like natural capital economic valuation methods. So we're not incorporating people's values in that way. So those are not the types of metrics that we're developing and trying to use with this framework. I hope that answers the question.
And I'll also just say that, you know, I think there's a sort of delicate balance between developing a model that you can call a general model that would be applicable everywhere, and then also making it able to be adapted to be context specific. And so we've done various different processes for sort of eliciting project specific information on how you actually adapt those models to a particular place. And some of that elicitation does try to bring up the sort of different human preferences and human values that people in particular places place on different parts of the system. And that's described a little bit more in that facilitation guide that I was talking about earlier. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I'll give people just a second to type something into the chat.
And I'd like to add something as well, Sarah. So one of the examples that Sarah didn't talk about today, but I think it's a really interesting one, and we hope to build others like this, is we also worked with the Natural Estuarine Research Reserve in Hawaii, and built out a case study that looked at cultural ecosystem services in particular. And so adapted some models to try to capture what they felt were their kind of cultural services there, which underpin the entire system, the way they work on it. So that's a really kind of interesting kind of application of this work as well. That's pretty different and is also available on our website.
Oh, we have one more question. Has there been any uptake or further interest by OMB to adopt the models?
Yeah, so with the shift in administration, we haven't continued dialogue with CEQ and OMB, that this has not been a priority for them. And so it's really kind of been on hold with the White House offices. And all of our work has really been with the agencies as they try to work through how they would do this and how they would integrate this more generally for practices across their sites. I do think that all of this experience has greatly informed our experiences. So if this does come forward again as a more kind of coordinated effort across agencies with the White House or others, I think when we started this, we weren't sure this would work. We weren't sure we'd be able to find a way to build consistency in a way that was kind of feasible, as well as create something that was easily accessible to people who weren't experts in ecosystem services. So we're hoping that these resources provide a way to do those things, which were kind of central to what agencies needed when we started the conversations with the White House and the agencies back in 2015.
So we have a question that asks, someone's interested to know if we have contacts with or are working with groups in the UK.
Not much. I would say I've interacted with a few people in the UK over the years, but there hasn't been a lot more recently. So yeah, nothing ongoing. If there's something specifically in the UK we should know about, I'd love to hear more.
All right, that was the last question in the list.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. Hope these resources were of value to you. And if you have any questions or suggestions for us, please feel free to reach out by email. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Enjoy your day.